Topic number 4. Is it mine? What's going on? Okay. Should be topic number 4 says the FBA did run away. And they did the same thing they claim Africans did to them. Uh, where the FBA, were the FBA an extension of American colonization? Whenever you see a prompt like that, you already know who it is. But this came with a link taking us to YouTube. We'll watch the video and then we'll discuss it.
I could start this story in 1847 when this region was the second black republic in the world after Haiti at the time. Or I could start it more than a century later, when back-to-back civil wars ravaged the nation due to sustained economic and political suppression. Or I could start it today and talk about how 5% of Liberia's population of 5 million people is descended from African American settlers. For me, the story of Liberia started taking shape most directly in 1816, when the number of free blacks in the United States was on a steady rise. That was when a group of Americans founded the American Colonization Society, ACS, to deal with the problem of the growing number of free blacks in the United States by resettling them in Africa. The biggest question at the time facing the leaders of America was what to do about slavery, whether to continue, whether to abolish it, whether the country could really be a home to free black people and enslaved black people at the same time. This was about 40 years before the United States would abolish slavery. Welcome to Reason Africa. The idea of an African-American colony in Africa was a fascinating question, with an obvious answer to many in the United States, but with a more complicated explanation. A colony for blacks outside the United States had been proposed several times, beginning in the 1700s, but it was the American Colonization Society's formation in 1816 that provided the impetus to make it a reality. The Colonization Society attracted a mixed bag of supporters. Slave owners pushed for free black people to be sent away from the United States because, according to them, they undermined the institution of slavery. They could have helped other slaves escape or, even worse, rebel. 5 years after its formation, the ACS launched its first trip to Liberia and founded a settlement and named it Monrovia, after U.S. President James Monroe, which later became the capital of Liberia, the oldest modern republic in the region. Over the decades, the number of blacks sailing to Liberia steadily increased. Upwards of 12,000 freeborn and formerly enslaved black Americans out of an approximate 4 million of them emigrated to Africa. The widely expected mass exodus of African Americans to Liberia never materialized in the grand scale it was expected. However, the settlers built schools, churches, and roads and formed a government modeled on the United States systems. The only problem was that the area already had inhabitants, and they were not very happy to see newcomers come in and take their land. The relations of the African American settlers with the natives were strained right from the get-go. The natives saw the black Americans as no more than dark-skinned occupiers. On the other hand, the African American settlers regarded the natives as uncivilized. The settlers marginalized the indigenous population and reduced them to the status of servitude. The fact that the freed enslaved who opted to return to Africa, where they hoped to enjoy complete liberty, would oppress other Africans, is one of the ironies of history. By the 1840s, many European countries had established colonies around Liberia and were pressuring the colony, the ACS, and even the United States to clarify Liberia's role and identity. Could Liberia broker treaties and trade agreements? Could it levy taxes? And could England or France annex the area if it was not claimed by any other country? Joseph Jenkins Roberts, a man born free in Virginia, who was the colony's first black governor in 1841, declared Liberia's independence in 1847 in efforts to establish a sovereign state, and was elected president the next year. The Declaration of Independence made Liberia the first black-ruled republic in Africa. But simmering tensions between the settlers and the indigenous people continued to grow and fester within the new nation. Many of the immigrants died due to diseases, countless wars with the natives and other causes. Yet, little by little, they established themselves as elites. Due to fears of the impact a free nation could have had on the issue of slavery in the United States, America did not recognize the nation it had played a role in creating until much later. Many people believe it's an oversimplification to say that African Americans colonized Liberia. So let's investigate and share your thoughts in the comment section below. When the first settlers came ashore in the region, they were not welcomed, not really. The immigrants' takeover of land and the injection of US customs and religion into their culture was resented by locals. Some mainstream scholars have argued that, in a sense, Liberia is a mirror image of the United States and its conquest and later settlement by Europeans. The American Colonial Society acquired Cape Mesurado, a 36-kilometer-long strip of land near present-day Monrovia, from the then indigenous ruler, with a threat of force if he declined to sell. The colony was extended along the coast as well as inland by use of force against native tribes. The immigrants created the same exclusionary practices they left behind in the States and, intentional or not, sowed the seeds for future civil conflict. They took a completely new political system that the natives knew nothing about and dominated the political system for almost 150 years. This is linked to a little-known historical fact. A short-lived nation called the Republic of Maryland, which comprised of black immigrants from the U.S. state of Maryland before merging with the Republic of Liberia. Upon formation of modern Liberia, Americo-Liberians treated the natives as white Americans had treated them, as second-class citizens and not deserving of the vote, very similar to South Africa's apartheid struggle that was dominated by an elite minority group who kept a tight rein on power. It was not until the 1940s that the native Africans got the right to vote in national elections. You'd imagine that since the immigrants who were former slaves themselves would know what it feels like to be subjugated and oppressed, instead, they established their own system of oppression and domination. All economic and political power in the country was concentrated. Through the true Whig Party, they controlled the government, the economy, and the state. Another issue at play was slavery. It was widely understood that African natives benefited from slavery by selling some Americo-Liberian ancestors into slavery in the Americas, as they were middlemen in the business. So perhaps this was a contributing factor why Americo-Liberians didn't cut any favors to the natives. In a short amount of time, abuse ensued. Lack of property rights for natives and forced labor without pay was the order of the day, which prompted a League of Nations investigation. Their report was damning. They found that certain Liberian officials forced natives to work on projects and even sent them out to labor on plantations abroad. Intimidation, humiliation, and compulsion were common methods used. Unfortunately, although the United States stood in an essentially similar relationship to Liberia as Britain did to Sierra Leone, and more distantly as France does to its former colonies in West Africa, it consequently avoided the duties implicit in that relationship. In spite of American enormous influence there, the United States never seriously urged reform against the oppression of natives by the elite of Liberia's ruling class. Tensions finally boiled over in 1980 when indigenous Africans carried out a coup which marked an end to the settlers' dominance as well as the beginning of 16 years of political instability. From there, we all know how the story went. Charles Taylor was found guilty by the ICC and is currently serving time for war crimes. With increasing intermarriages in recent decades and warming of relations between Americo-Liberians and indigenous Liberians, the Republic of Liberia is today a stable democracy and is continuing its journey of development as a strong member of the community of nations. America's influence remains strong in the country. The Liberian flag closely resembles the stars and the stripes of the US flag. Some architecture in the country resembles 19th century houses. English is the official language, and the US dollar is generally accepted as currency. I hope you enjoyed the video, guys. Please hit like and subscribe if you did.
Yeah, I've said it here before. People don't like it, but when you go back and you read some of those guys from Delaney, even to Gavi, they had a funny mindset about Africans, man. It's we have to go and civilize the savage African and all this type of stuff. I never was a fan of that language when I read it. Um, so what we see now with the FBA and the ADOS with the American mindset, to me, it's not a new thing. There's nothing new. Some would say there's nothing new under the sun, right? It's not a new thing. There's always this mindset of exceptionalism coming out of America, and that if you go to Africa, you got to go there on some, uh, you know, tamed brute or the savage. And I personally, I just could never gel with that well. Carl, what say you to this?
Well, I agree. I believe it was Garvey, and I'm paraphrasing here. He said that if the Negro is not careful, he will consume all of the effects. He will drink of all the poison of Western civilization and die from the effects of it. And then we see that these Africans who were formerly slaves themselves, who had been liberated from their oppression, only to go and oppress other Africans, because in their mind they were not Africans anymore. They had been civilized through Christianity and things like that, that made them look down on fellow Africans, even though they only made up a small minority of the population. I mean, even if you look at the flag of Liberia, it still has the red, white, and blue. You name the capital after President James Monroe, who was a slave owner. So it kind of gives you insight to where these people's mind is. But the whole thing about the FBA and ADOS, whatever the fuck they call themselves, they're not coming from a historical knowledge, because Black people, not only did Black Americans flee, Black Americans can continue to flee. So if you look, there's a place in the Dominican Republic called Samana. So I'm probably saying it wrong, but in the 1820s, free slaves went down there to that area. It was a part of Haiti at the time, and then they lived there. The students live there to this day. So you got Black Americans fleeing America to go live in Haiti. So the Underground Railroad. So the Underground Railroad took you to Canada. So you had Black Americans fleeing slavery. They didn't just stay and fight. No, they left to Canada, and their descendants live down there today. You have some Black people in Mexico who were fleeing slavery in the South. Mexico ended slavery in 1821. So many former slaves. There's a lot of Black Seminoles who live in Mexico. They still speak English. So this whole idea that black people didn't flee is quite ridiculous. Another example. Now they call it the Great Migration. I don't really care for that term because it's really what it really was is ethnic cleansing. Black Americans fleeing the South to go to the northern states that tend to be more hospitable, for the time. But black people have always moved around about the country. They're moving out west. Now some are moving south. Now some are moving to Ghana. This whole idea that they put forth that we're the fighters, we're the ones who stayed and we fight, that's a bunch of nonsense. Because there's plenty of, it was going to Canada when the Fugitive Slave Act was in effect. It was going to Mexico, and it's not rooted in any real historical knowledge. So yeah, this it's not. So they did colonize these people, and they internalized white supremacy, and that's what happens to a lot of us. Excuse me, that we take from the dominant culture, and it makes us hate ourselves and the people who look like us. So we got to be real careful about what knowledge we consume from this society, and look what it does. And white people know this. They know that type of behavior is going to come when too many of us take what they say at face value. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
I appreciate that. Yeah, there's a lot of black Americans ended up in Trinidad, man. Fifth Company. Some ended up in Red Bay's Andres, down there where I'm from, where Buano's from. So yeah, this idea of not fleeing is some nonsense. But Oni, what say you to this?
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, I think everybody knows that it's nonsense. The idea that Black Americans haven't fled. I think. I think it's a pretty interesting summary. But was this guy like an Indian though? I didn't really get the accent. I don't know. Maybe East African. I don't know.
I thought he was Liberian personally, but go ahead.
Oh, you thought he was Liberian? Oh, that's what they sound? I don't know. Shit, he fled. You know what I'm saying? You know they fled. Yeah. So, yeah, I think it's pretty clear. I think everybody knows that they fled. But I think what's interesting is that Martin Delaney has this book where he was describing what would be the solution for African Americans, and this was during the time that African Americans were still enslaved. And he was like, yeah, actually, going to Canada was like his ancestors were saying going to Canada might be the best thing to do for African Americans. As to say that African Americans back then thought fleeing is a good thing. I think not fleeing, like if we really talk about when we talk about fleeing, we're really talking about like the big resistance to fleeing is how could you do that logistically? Like that's really the big argument against it. But it's like, yeah, I think economic mobility is an important thing to have. Getting out of a bad situation is an important thing to have. We were just talking about a kid who was abused, whatever, right? Like him being able to get out of that situation is better than him staying in that situation. Like realistically, like actually, I don't know if you guys heard or if you guys saw recently this young black boy was just throwing out his trash, and the police arrested him in this country. This was like a week ago, or like maybe over the weekend. I don't know. I guess it's the weekend, so maybe like in the last week, kids just throwing out trash, and he gets arrested. That kind of and of course they release him because he's the wrong person or whatever. But it's like this kind of a weird treatment from this country, and then just knowing that economic migration is a normal thing for human beings, and just knowing that a lot of Black Americans are living in cities right now, particularly northern cities, I guess, but they're living in cities because economic migration is so normal, right? It's just really like a bizarre thing to say, oh yeah, I was in a terrible situation and I didn't leave. I didn't leave it. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, like kind of like I think somebody brought up Tina Turner earlier. It's like, oh yeah, I stayed with my man. like okay, like that's not a good thing. You know what I mean? Like that's the wrong choice. So yeah, I think everybody knows that Black Americans did leave. I don't think I think what happened with regard to Tweet Nasheed and them is that they're trying to like I noticed that Black Americans, I guess every group really has to have a story that makes them seem good. You know, that makes them seem better than they are. And I guess the story that African Americans will tell themselves is, look, look how good we are. You know, like everybody has it. You know what I mean? Like a Jamaican, I don't really know the stories of Jamaica, honestly, but you know, I'll just say it that way. But as far as I can tell, you know, Jamaicans might be like, oh yeah, look how good we are at dancing, or look how good we are at sex, or look how good we are at music. You know what I mean? And so I think African Americans do the same, you know, more or less the same thing. You know, and I don't like again, like I can't fault somebody for having that narrative. It's like you should have positive propaganda on yourself. The trouble is when somebody else has negative propaganda on you and you internalize that, you know. And of course, I'm not saying we didn't internalize it, but I'm not going to fault people for, you know, just for being misinformed. But like, there's a reason for being misinformed.
Really quickly, I would say a big obstacle is also financial logistics, but also too, there's a lot of Black Americans who feel that we built this country, and I'm saying that air quotes. So because we built this country, we should be able to reap in the benefits of this country. I think that's a faulty logic. It's like saying, okay, well, you know what? They built this country through slave labor. So because they built this country through slave labor, you know, you should benefit in the slave labor. That's a lot of Black Americans had. I don't even want to call it Stockholm syndrome, because in Stockholm syndrome, you know, the captor was nice to you. We suffer through battered wife syndrome, because this country is continuously battering us and letting us know they don't give a fuck about us. And yet at the same time, you still have Black Americans rocking the red, white, and blue, and you know, singing the Star Spangled Banner. So I think it is logistics, but also it's almost like, well, we were here too, so we should be able to participate in all the neo-colonialism and U.S. imperialism that they take advantage of. It's a sick situation.
To my Native American Haitian brethren, here's what I would say to this prompt. You know, always go back to the author. The author is important, especially when he tried to create narratives of rules for thee and not for me. The author was born in Alabama, left Alabama, went to Detroit, left Detroit, went to California. Now, he wouldn't consider that as running, even though he said in his, well, I guess in his mind, the situation here is not favorable for me being here, therefore I need to move, which most people do. You know what I mean? I don't see nothing wrong with that at all. But why would you want to limit other black people to one place just because they was born there? Black people been moving all over the planet forever. So just because we decide, well, this situation where I was born into it, an affable one for me, let me just get up and get out of here. You know, I don't see nothing wrong if you feel like the situation is not advantageous for you to leave, to leave, to leave. And there's nothing wrong with that. African Americans say, well, living in the South ain't too kind for me right now. Let me bounce and go to Canada. Or like Carl was saying, we going to Mexico. Like when he was saying, oh, we going to Liberia. Let's get the hell out of here. Some of them say, you know what, we about to bounce to Trinidad and see what the Trinidadians talking about. Or the Haitians. You know, that to me, this is the wisest thing to do. Because if I know living where I live in, my child might get hanged from a rope, of course I would want to leave. So, oh, we got to stay back and fight. When you outgunned, when you outgunned, what do you got to do in that scenario? You know, they don't. It's like they want to be this valorous hero who's, the grave full of valorous heroes who attempted. There sometimes you should fight back, absolutely, If I do agree with that, but there are sometimes you need to just leave the situation and try to develop yourself elsewhere. This
Only
is
a
a
fool fights in a burning house.
this is an intelligent thing to me in my head. This is in my head where, but I find that this video have a lot of left out information. Left out information. Why I would say that is because even though American colonization society was integral in moving some Africans to Liberia, there were also the Gavi movement. They try to keep Gavi out of Liberia. And I think that the same situation would have happened if Gavi was successful in taking many Africans to Liberia, because some African Americans did go to Liberia off of the speed of the UNIA movement. But I think that what is also missing out of this prompt is the process of decolonization. And when I say that, I mean of the mind of people, because you can't have people who've been colonized for 400 years moving and going to a specific area without the process of decolonizing their mind. What do you expect that for them to do? They're gonna act like where they just came from. Of course, they act like Americans. And what do Americans do? What do Americans do? They can say, "Well, this is our space. This is our private property. We believe in private rights. These are our laws, and we're gonna install these laws." If you don't go through the process of decolonization, say, "Well, look, that brother over there is your brother. We do things different in this area. We have customs we need to sort out and so forth, or whatever." Nah, that's not gonna happen. You know what I mean? Americans practice gunboat diplomacy. This shit is ours, and we take it over. So I think that there should be a process of decolonization of the minds of people before you try to have these kinds of human experiments. Of course, these things is gonna happen and kick up. We have to be reintroduced to one another on the premise of you are my brother and I see you on equal footing with me. If that doesn't happen, of course, people who've been colonized for 300 years going to do what colonized people do. And I don't fault them for that at all. I just think the mistake was because the Americans probably knew this. In creating, they create a poison pill. They say, "Yeah, we're gonna free you and liberate you, and we're gonna put you back into the Africa. We're gonna reintegrate you into the African continent." But I don't believe that the white fathers of America were so friendly and wanted no. They gonna put a poison pill. They can know they say, "Okay, yeah, we're gonna send these elitist Negroes over there who think they just like us, and let me see what they're gonna do there, because they don't want you to win." So that would be the poison pill they put. But to properly prepare people, you're supposed to go through certain processes, send skilled labor, absolutely, but also decolonizing the mind of these Black people, and that didn't happen yet. And I think that this is the same premise that's happening all over the Black world. To be honest with you, you give us freedom or independence without decolonizing the minds of the people, and watch how the institutions work. They break down because it's almost like putting a dog vest on a cat suit. Yeah, it's ridiculous. You call this place Nigeria and give them British laws and expect them to run the country like British men when all of them are a bunch of Africans. And then say, "Well, look at these niggas over there can't run a state properly." Of course, because it's not an African state. It has it has all the cultures and features of British society on a bunch of African people, and say, "Yeah, here you go, Negroes, you all operate." Of course, it's going to be a failed state eventually, because it's not created out of the mind of the African mind. So I think that this was the mistake. But I would only say to Azuli, just to go a little bit deeper, dig a little bit deeper, go into the Gavi movement, see what they did in Liberia, see the mistakes was there, and also them moving in other places. But I don't think that they was mistaken in moving. I think it was an intelligence thing on their part in leaving the circumstances they was in and trying to find another place and remedy for them. Because he said, "Well, yes, we should have fight. He was outgunned, he was going to be slaughtered. And he would have no ancestors to talk about." I think it was intelligence on their part to leave the situation they was in and move to a more advantageous situation. But I'll just leave it there.
My grandmother used to say something. She used to say, "Don't carry that dirt from over there and bring it here." And I guess my follow-up question of sorts is, do you think the continental Africans, having witnessed what went down in Liberia, for example, do you think that makes continental Africans more wary about extending a hand for repatriation, particularly from Black America back to the continent? Do you guys think that's why they kind of been dragging their feet on that type of thing?
I think that they have good reason to suspect that. I mean, the way so many of us Black Americans have internalized American culture that we don't really recognize how toxic and how radioactive even it is to other Africans. So I do think that is something to give pause. Like, hey, we didn't even invite you back. You kind of just inserted yourselves here, and look what you did. You took over this country. You treated the natives like they did the Native Americans in the U.S. or how they did African slaves, and you enslaved these people. And these are your own people. They look exactly like you. So if I was an African on the continent, I would trust but verify. Kind of see before we're accepting you back. We kind of got to see what your mindset is. What are your intentions with our country? But it has to be rooted in Pan Africanism. It can't be individual, you know, success. It has to be rooted within a Pan African ideology. Because if it's not, we're just going to continue to spread this nonsense all over the continent.
Yeah, what I can say about this is, I think the only people who would be wary are the people in Liberia. I feel like education, like kind of like how Trigger Happy just mentioned, there's Brazilians who are pretty successful in certain African countries, but like we don't hear about them. So most people around the world really are not really hearing about the American Liberia situation connection outside of America and Liberia. You know what I mean? And the other thing is that most continental Africans are not in positions of power or in positions of authority. On top of the fact that most are not even learning anything, but the people in position of authority, they're not worried about the vast, they're not even worried about their own people, let alone African Americans. You know what I mean? Uh, because like, why would they be like what they're worried about is pretty much like other world leaders. You know what I mean? Like what is like I think there was a video of ECOWAZ that recently came out, or they showed like ECOWAZ whatever, and it's just a bunch of white folk, just a bunch of Europeans. That's who you know Buhari has an audience with. He's not in a room of college students in Nigeria trying to make decisions. He's not in a room with the layperson in Nigeria. He's in a room with foreign interests. And unfortunately, African Americans are are not organized in such a way that they can culminate to foreign interest. And I just wanted to just touch on Black Steel's point earlier, right? Cool name. Black Steel's point earlier uh, about Black people in America and how they feel like they deserve something here. That's the reality of most people, or at least especially in America. Most of us kind of feel we deserve something. Like we deserve from other people. Like, you know what I mean? Like we just feel entitled. You know? I don't fully understand. I think even if Black Americans didn't go through the experience that obviously their ancestors went through, like they would still feel entitled. The rationale of, oh yeah, well, we did something, is kind of just like icing on, like kind of just, oh, how can I guilt somebody into thinking this as well? But like even like white people feel entitled to like America. You know what I mean? Or even like any foreigner would feel entitled. Like America just has this weird, like it has a really bad social system, really bad social education. And this is why I don't even take it, like I take it all in a grain of salt. And like I said, I just think anybody listening, you know, uh like particularly if you don't have any children, obviously, if you have the ability, just leave. You know what I mean? It's really not worth it. Now, granted, most of us, like many of us, do have kids, and many of us are bound to this economic system, so that's different. But if you could find your freedom, um, get it, you know. And I think one of the points, I can't really find the book on the PDF, but there's this book called Garvey and Garveyism by Amy Jacques Garvey, and she points out that at the time that Garvey was active, people were saying that people were actually praising the Caribbeans as the more radical population among the blacks in America, because they were more mobile people, because they actually like moved around for better opportunities and so forth. And that was like a wider reputation for Caribbeans at the time. And I could see that also, like, as to say, like, who exactly would be a pioneer kind of person? It'd not be the person who's like, hey, look, let me stay on the plantation, let me so on and so forth. And even before I, embraced the Caribbean identity, like I kind of embraced the Northern identity. And the thing about the civil rights movement, that at least that how we learned in the North, was that a lot of us from the North went south and started violating the policies. Whereas, the policies, the blacks in the South might not have violated it as much, you know. And even if we listen to this video, they were talking about how they had to get rid of free blacks because of how they upset the social order. I have to say that realistically, sometimes, like when you don't really move, you might have to be more docile than the people who have that wider freedom of movement. And I'll say that.
Oh,
Anybody else
lastly,
going
yeah,
yeah.
to trigger Happy's statements in terms of the Afro Brazilians, he has to remember. Well, I'm sure he remembers that the Brazilians speak Portuguese, and they would probably be more inclined to go to places like Angola. You probably see their populations in Angola, and in terms of what they would have done, and because the world is largely English speaking, more or less, how things are promoted. You're gonna hear from the more of the English speaking world as opposed to the Portuguese world. So I think that since the Portuguese world is so small, much smaller, but even though they may have done certain things, because many of us are not Portuguese speakers, we probably won't hear these kinds of things in certain circles. So I think that that's probably the reason why you really don't never hear about it as much.
Appreciate that. Does anyone else have any last words? If not, let me read a couple of messages in the chat. Trigger Happy 262 Plus says, this is why he's strong in his opinion on the African spirituality conversation. Because if you really want standard African orientation, the only way you are getting it is through that. He goes on to say, when we have an African orientation in education and in culture and our overall system of psychotherapy, we can deal with the world as Africans. This also makes repatriation smoother for our people. Real Black Gentleman, RBG, in the chat says, African nations don't have the will at present to develop coherent policy about repatriation of blacks returning from the West. There are like 30-odd countries in play concerning the Atlantic trade. He says, lastly, there will be this coastal sensibility about it, and countries will try to marginalize themselves out of the discussion. Lastly, Trigger Happy says, they didn't go to Angola, fam. They went to Ghana and Nigeria. I don't think I've even heard about repatriation communities historically there, so that's kind of unfair. Oh, that's what I meant, Ghana and Nigeria? Yeah, I'll be honest with you. You guys raised something here tonight. I've never really heard about Afro-Brazilians and Afro-Cubans heading back to the continent. Like, it's never come up in a discussion or anything I've read before. That's very interesting. So I
what I've heard is, in fact, I've heard it's opposite. I've heard that there was a large contingency of people who came from Nigeria who actually were slaves in Brazil. So when they went back, they actually went back, going back to their homeland from Nigeria. And now you have the reverse of that happening. Now, Nigerians travel, Nigerians travel all over the world. So there are many Nigerians who actually live in Brazil. You know what I mean? So they get reintroduced to their community, the community of the so-called slave community that originally came from Nigeria to Brazil. They have a large contingency of people there, so they mix and mingle amongst one another. So I see why they would want to go to Nigeria. But I'm talking in terms of language. I'm sure there are Afro-Brazilians, because of the language, Afro-Brazilians who would be more inclined to go to Angola as opposed to Nigeria.
All right, Juana, thanks for that. Since there's no last words, Trigger Happy 262 responds. He says there is a Tamban community in Ghana that were Afro-Brazilians, and they essentially intermingle with the Ga ethnic group in Ghana. All right, that's more information. That's good information. Did not know that. But you know what? For time's sake, because we ended at 11, let's go to Shoot the Breeze topic number 5 tonight.